how Brady unethically used an Aurora Theater victim's family in a stunt lawsuit, and why it ultimately worked. Plus, Kostas Moros on why including gun suicides in gun violence stats is misleading. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with the latest on guns in America. This week, we are looking at the debate over gun violence and how to categorize gun violence, including whether or not gun-related suicides should be part of that count. And we have a special guest with us, Kostas Moros, who's a gun rights lawyer based in California, who just wrote a piece on the Reload on this topic for us, did an analysis piece. Sometimes we have outside writers come and do pieces for us, and Kostas has done a couple for us in the past, and now we've got a brand new one up over at the Reload. It's not a member exclusive, so anyone listening is free to go and read it. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today, Kostas?
Good, Stephen. Good. Sorry for your listeners. As much as I'm honored to be on Stephen's show, I don't usually wear a suit, but I'm coming out of a court hearing on Zoom, so you get me in the suit today. It's always a pleasure to be on the show, and always an honor to be featured in the Reload.
Yeah, I did. Was coming off a CNN interview last week when I filmed the podcast, so I was wearing a suit last week. Now I'm wearing my more casual attire. For anyone watching on YouTube, I know that this goes over the head of everyone listening on the podcast,
right.
But anyone watching on YouTube, yes, that sometimes the show's very classy by accident, but still. So yeah, you want to tell us just a little bit more about your background before we get going?
Sure. For listeners who haven't heard me or read about me before, I am a lawyer for Michelle & Associates out in California. We regularly represent the California Rifle and Pistol Association in its litigation against various state gun laws, some local ones too. For example, the most famously, I think, is the magazine case Duncan v. Becerra, which led to Freedom Week a few years ago. That's actually what led me to seek out the job at the firm originally. Now I'm working on the case, which is fun. But yeah, that's what we're most well known for.
Yeah, and obviously you wrote the piece in your personal capacity, not as representative.
Correct. I'm not a statistician by trade either, just to be clear. I'm an attorney who likes to nerd out on statistics.
Right. And so, just to be upfront with everyone, so everybody has a full understanding of your background and also the role in just in you writing this piece for the Reload. You are an outside contributor who works for a gun rights group, lawyers, but didn't write this piece in that capacity.
Correct.
Just to be crystal clear on all of that. So let's get into this. You argue in this piece that essentially gun suicides should not be counted as gun violence, especially when discussing gun restrictions or policies to that regard, gun laws, essentially. Can you just give us a quick breakdown of your basic argument here?
So the basic argument is that, of course, suicide matters, including suicides that are gun-related. In fact, it matters a lot because gun-related suicides are responsible for over 20,000 losses a year. So this is a massive amount of suffering, and it needs to be addressed. The problem, though, I think, and this is me speaking as an advocate, you might have a different take as a journalist, is that these gun control organizations, they seem to want to use suicide to inflate the count, but their policies don't actually really touch on suicide, except for a couple that conceivably could, which I covered in the piece. So when they talk about this gun violence rate or the gun deaths, they want the layperson to evoke images of criminals, mass shooters, general homicides, and assaults. What they don't really implicate there is suicide. But if you ever push them on this, and I have, they'll say, "What, you don't think suicide matters?" And it's like, no, of course it does. But this is a very distinct problem that is separate, I think, from what gun control purports to solve generally, except for the few that call for a complete ban on guns, I guess, because as I mentioned in the piece, things like assault weapons bans, magazine capacity limits, they don't matter to suicide. I mean, it's grim to say, but you can kill yourself just fine with a flintlock pistol. It doesn't take much to be effective in that grim task. So that's where I come from on this. And sorry, I know that's a bit more advocacy, but that's what I am. So.
No, certainly. And just give us an idea. In your piece, you talk about the breakdown between gun violence and gun suicide. Like how much of an effect does including suicides in a gun violence count have on that final number?
Well, it more than doubles it, because suicides most years are, I think, around 55 or 60%. I think now, because of the surge in homicides, the proportion of suicide has actually fallen a bit, but it's still a majority. I think the number, let me pull up the piece here. The number was suicides in 2020 were 53.7% of gun-related deaths, and homicides were 42.9%, and the remaining balance were, accidents, law enforcement shootings, and undetermined. So
right, and that comes from the CDC.
That's the right? CDC numbers, yes. So that's my good friends at the CDC, but that's where those numbers come from, yeah.
And they get those by asking coroners, essentially, are required to report
correct
these numbers to the CDC. So it's a fairly reliable method of determining this, right?
It's the most comprehensive that exists, as far as I know. So yeah, it's what we have to rely on. Yeah.
Right, because obviously there's a lot of things when it comes to guns in America where you're dealing with things that are more like estimates,
right?
Close guesses. You're using survey-based information that tries to come up with a statistically significant group of people to ask, but isn't a one-to-one like this. This is a little more reliable, perhaps, these numbers, because they are literally all of the coroner's reports from across the entire country, and it's based on what the coroners are saying about these deaths that they're recording.
And correct. And I think it's also worth adding for the homicide numbers, the 43% approximately that are homicides, is that the CDC is kind of agnostic on what a homicide is when it comes to, it just says it's gun related. So that includes, for example, it doesn't include law enforcement because they categorize that differently, but it does include justified homicides. So a few of those are certainly not murders. They're justified homicides. So that's worth noting too.
And that's also why when we talk about crime statistics, of course, it's important to understand where these numbers come from. So most crime statistics, when you're talking about murder, people aren't citing the CDC numbers. Because CDC doesn't give you a lot of information about the homicide, just that there was a homicide and the type of weapon used is categorized to a broad degree, like guns. But most people will cite FBI numbers when it comes to homicide.
Well, we can't anymore.
Right. Yes. It's a significant problem now because the FBI changed their method of collecting homicide data, or really all crime data, in 2020, which is probably the worst possible time to do it. And they haven't had good compliance rates from police departments. But I'm just getting at the point that these numbers are going to be a little bit different from the FBI to the CDC because of the way they go about collecting them. The FBI will give you more detailed numbers, especially back when they had a lot better compliance with their reporting system pre-2020. So you look at the 2019 numbers, those are sort of the last really solid numbers the FBI have, but they delve into more about the victims and the types of weapons beyond just guns. That's where you get a lot of like rifles are involved in 500 murders a year or so, including all.
And they do distinguish between murders and other kinds of homicide as well, which is important. Yeah.
And the CDC doesn't do that.
No.
And so this is sort of a different set of numbers. It's reliable for the reasons we talked about, but it's different than what you're probably used to hearing if you're someone out there listening to reports on murder in the United States, because a lot of those focus on the FBI numbers because they're a bit more detailed. But their collection methods are different. So, I just think it's important to note where these numbers come from and what we're talking about here. But from what we understand, generally speaking, and this is backed up with, as you said, there's been a slight change the last couple of years because of the murder surge that we've experienced in the United States. But generally speaking, suicides are far more common than murders when it comes to gun deaths. That's the basic point, right?
Yes, it's undeniable. In fact, if anything, the homicide surge has reduced that a bit, but in every year till now, as far as I'm aware, suicides are a majority of gun-related
usually it's
deaths.
closer to 2/3. Right?
Yes, yeah, 60%, 2/3, something like that most years. Yeah,
but you will often see gun control advocates use gun death rate, right?
yes. And look, there is value to a measure of gun-related death, which is what I prefer to call it. But you have to be clear about what you're talking about. So if you're going into a holistic, if, for example, you were writing an article and said, we need to deal with guns, and you say in the beginning, guns are used in homicides, they're used in suicides, and this is our total gun-related death. They don't do that. They don't say the word suicide usually unless they're pressed on it. And then they'll say, they'll go into it a little bit. But if you're not being transparent and you're just saying gun deaths or gun violence, people aren't thinking about suicide because that's not what the word violence evokes, and when you're thinking about gun deaths, you're usually thinking about, and they do this very purposefully, a criminal attacking someone, not suicide.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's two specific examples that you use in your piece about how this can be misleading. Can you just go over those real quick? I think one was significantly worse than the other. The Violence Project,
oh my gosh.
has
they have
a website about concealed carry killers, right?
So the Violence Policy Center has a website, like Stephen says, called the Concealed Carry Killers, and that one measures all, I guess, gun-related death caused by supposedly these concealed carry killers. I'm doing scare quotes there for the people listening on the podcast. And they count, I think it was approximately 2,400 from 2007 to about a year ago, 2022 is what their date range is. The problem is, and if you go into their background page, they have a nice little chart which shows you what this is made up of. And over 1,200 of these 2,400 are suicides. And they're not even murder suicides because they count murder suicides separately. So these are just 1,200 people who just killed themselves, hurt nobody else. And Violence Policy Center calls them killers because they had a carry permit. And even, there's other issues with that website. For one, they list about 500 convicted murderers, but it doesn't say if those murderers killed somebody out in public or at home, because if they killed somebody at home, that the carry permit isn't even relevant to the discussion, really.
Sure, yeah. but I think that's the most egregious, perhaps, example of this problem you're talking about.
Yeah.
Where committing suicide is not only counted as gun violence, but they're labeling people who do that as killers.
Yeah, it's shameful. I think I would hope even many others on the gun control side would agree that that's not acceptable and that they wouldn't do that. I think the Violence Policy Center should probably change that, or at least change the name of its website. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, I think that's probably the worst example that you were able to put into this piece, but it's not the only one, right? So there's a more mainstream sort of use of this gun death rate statistic. Talk about that. Everytown, I believe.
Everytown is the one. Yeah. So Everytown ranks every state by their Everytown grade. And they score them based on how much gun control they pass. And then they also tell you their gun death rate. Now, the reason they do this is because if you combine suicides and homicides together into just a gun death rate number, there does appear to be some correlation, at least visually, between, states that have a lot of gun control and states that have low gun death rates. The problem for them, and I think they realize this, and that's why they do this, is that doesn't work if you just count homicides. If you count homicides, there's no apparent correlation between these scores, whether it be Giffords or Everytown, and their gun-related homicide rate, or even overall homicide rate. There's no correlation. So they're kind of torturing the data here and saying gun death rate to include suicide so they can show you that, look at all these states that have all this gun control and they have a low gun death rate. Well, that's misleading, I think.
And as you mentioned at the start of the show here, this statistic, this gun death rate statistic, and this idea that it correlates with gun laws is used to push primarily policies that have no effect on suicide. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So if they're going to use suicides, gun-related suicides, as a platform to push gun laws, and not only use them, but it's more than half of their count, then you would think that, okay, fine, but a lot of these policies should be related to stopping suicide. Otherwise, you're just using this number to push unrelated, when I say unrelated, dealing with homicide, gun control laws. So I went through every town's criteria that they use to grade states, and I think I found just 3, maybe 4, I think it was 3 gun laws that, even if they worked, if we gave them the benefit of the doubt and just assumed that these laws do what they say and accomplish their purpose, only 3 out of about 40 had anything to do with suicide. I think those were red flag laws. Conceivably, I guess you could stop someone from committing suicide by having their guns taken. There were safe storage laws, and I believe there was one more. My memory's failing me right now, but there was one more there that if it had mental health
involuntarily commitment.
Yes. So those 3 could conceivably, if they worked, stop suicide. But it's such a small percent for a problem that, gun-related suicides over half of the gun deaths they report, but only a small fraction of their proposed solutions. Like I said earlier, their marquee items are like assault weapons bans, magazine restrictions, licensing. That's not going to stop somebody who's suicidal. Often these people don't have any kind of criminal record. The background check won't stop them. And again, you don't need a 30-round magazine to commit suicide. So,
And in addition to that, you also looked at international rates of suicide compared to the United States. How does the United States compare to other countries that have much stricter gun laws and far fewer firearms?
Right. So this argument that, and this is one of the arguments we get when we point this out, they'll push back and say, well, if we had better gun control and guns were less available, because of this stricter gun control, there would be less suicides because, and this is undeniable, a suicide attempt with a gun is more likely to succeed than somebody trying to poison themselves or even hang themselves. I think maybe only jumping off of things is comparable to guns in its finality. But there clearly would be at least a large degree of substitution because the United States, for all its guns, and we have a lot of them, is still within the normal range of first world suicide rates. Now, I'm not going to deny we are on the higher end of that range, of that normal range, but it's not like our homicide numbers where we're way outside, the normal range for first world countries. There's a handful of countries that are wealthy and have very strict gun control and have higher suicide rates than us. I think the article listed as examples Japan, South Korea, and Belgium. And I think there were others as well.
Yeah. So I believe the piece you cite a statistic that shows there's 14.6 per 100,000 suicides in the United States compared to South Korea, which has 24.6. If I'm remembering the numbers correctly here. That is a pretty stark difference, especially considering, the fact that the United States is far and away the leader in civilian gun ownership, and South Korea has some extremely strict gun laws and very few firearms per resident. So, obviously there's more going on. There's more at play here than just gun availability or gun laws when it comes to suicide, right? Is that basic conclusion?
And you can see this too by the we also have, although gun suicides I think are the majority of suicides in the United States, we do have it's not a huge majority. We still have over 20,000, I think. I said the number in the piece, but of non-gun related suicides. So I think there would be a significant amount of substitution here. I'm going to be intellectually honest. If someone cast a magic spell and every gun in the country disappeared tomorrow morning, would our suicide rate drop a little? Perhaps, but I don't think it's as dramatic as people might assume. I think it might drop, a tiny amount, but there would be substitution for other methods, because that's what other countries I've seen. I believe I should have included this in the piece, but I had read about how Australia, following its restrictions on guns, the gun ownership rate did decline, but the suicide rate didn't. there was substitution seen in that context, but I guess I should save that piece for another day when I've actually looked at the data thoroughly.
Right. That's always an important part
Yeah.
of publishing piece. Yes. But I think ultimately, obviously you're clearly not saying that gun suicide should be ignored, or that it's not a problem, or that gun owners and gun control advocates alike shouldn't try to come up with the most effective way to reduce the use of firearms to commit suicide. Certainly there are initiatives. We've had podcasts dedicated specifically to this topic within the gun owning community about how to do that. Some of the best practices. There's Walk the Talk America is one example. That's who we had on for the podcast. But there are a number of initiatives out there trying to tackle this problem because it is a serious problem. But you're saying, and I think rather persuasively, obviously we published the piece, so I was fairly convinced by your arguments here, but that including gun suicides into a gun violence category is really just misleading people about what you're trying to get across, right? That's what it comes down to, basically.
Right. And I'd have far less of an objection, although this might still mislead people, if they labeled it gun-related death or said gun violence counting suicides, as long as people need to be aware of it. And look, suicide is a huge issue. And I'm the first, I think we talked about this yesterday on a call when we were discussing the article, which was that I always tell people on my side, look, if you are battling depression, or if someone in your family is, and either lock up your guns if it's someone in your family so that you're certain they can't get them, or get them out of the house, because as big of a risk, self-defense is important, but if somebody is battling depression in your house, that's the bigger threat to life when there's a gun in the house than any sort of potential crime. So I'm not, trying to belittle suicide at all. It's a huge concern, and we need to watch out for people who display signs of that and get them the help they need, including encouraging them to temporarily dispossess themselves of the guns until they are in a better place, until they are treated. But yes, as you cited, I kind of frankly despise how these groups use these sad stories, these personal tragedies, as a platform when their policies don't even really relate to them very much, if at all. That's the long and short of it.
Yeah. And by the way, just as an aside here, anyone who is struggling with that or knows someone who is should reach out to a group like Walk the Talk America.
Absolutely.
For help. That's the best thing you can do is to try and reach out to somebody who is trained in these areas to help people. And I would encourage anyone who is in that situation to do so. But I do want to talk about the other piece you recently wrote for us a little while back that is in the same vein, in the same category as this one, but deals more specifically with California. So in the wake of the mass shootings that happened there in January, you saw Governor Newsom touting California's gun death rate as evidence that, again, the strict gun control policies he supports work. Can you tell us a little bit more about California in particular on this topic?
Oh, I have a lot to say about my home state, but we'll keep it focused here. So Governor Newsom, my friend Governor Newsom, he did indeed come out and say after the series of mass shootings, at least the first one, I don't know if the second one had happened yet at that point, but he came out and used this same sort of tactic, the gun death rate, and used that to proclaim that California has a lower overall gun death rate. Of course, California has a very low suicide rate comparatively, but a pretty average. I think it's on the better side of things, so it isn't bad, but the homicide rate is nothing extraordinary. And I think the piece that I had done, it's been a minute since I looked at it, but it compared its next door neighbors, because I always think that's the best comparison as opposed to going across the country, because there's more of a closer relationship with neighboring states. And Arizona, Nevada, and Oregon, and all those states have less gun control than California. I know Oregon recently passed its magazine capacity limits and licensing, but that hasn't really even
Right.
taken effect yet. So Oregon, while it's not Arizona, but it was less. It did have a lot less gun control than California did. Oregon has half the homicide rate. Nevada has almost the same homicide rate. I want to say it was 4.4 versus 4.7, and Arizona is only slightly higher at 5.1 per 100,000 versus California's 4.4. And these are all states to
Yes.
varying degree, especially Arizona, which have significantly less gun control, and they're right next door. But they do
Right.
have higher suicide rates. All of them, I believe. I can't recall Oregon. So that's where that's what Governor Newsom latches onto to make his point.
Yeah, in your piece on this, which is a member exclusive, by the way, the new one is free for everyone. This one is a member exclusive. You talk about how every town's gun law strength rating for California is 86.5, which is among the highest, if not the highest.
Yeah, it is the highest.
Arizona is an 8.5, yet the difference in their murder rate, their gun murder rate, is negligible. It's 4.4 to 5.1.
And that was just that year. I think it was a couple times in the 2010s.
Yeah.
I think 2015, Arizona had a lower rate, and that was after 5 years of their constitutional carry being enacted. So California is usually a little bit lower than Arizona, but it does fluctuate, and the states tend to be very close together year after year, despite being polar opposites on the degree of gun rights that they honor.
Yeah, and there's lots of other states as well. I think you're right as far as comparing neighbors goes, especially when you have two neighboring states that are so starkly aligned in this issue. There's such stark divisions between Arizona, which, like you mentioned, is a permitless carry state. It has no assault weapons ban. It's one of the states that has the least restrictive gun laws in the country. And then California, of course, is right next door with what I think many would argue are the most restrictive gun laws.
Yeah, and I also like Arizona because it counters a claim I hear. So usually when you make these sorts of claims, a lot of the states with the low homicides rates are states like New Hampshire, Vermont, Wyoming, Idaho, and the usual counter argument to that is, well, these are rural states. Arizona isn't California, but it's not exactly a rural state. It certainly has rural parts, but Phoenix is a very big city. It has other big cities there in that state. So it makes for a good comparison for that reason as well. It's not just another, rural backwater, as they call it, quote unquote. So it is a populous metropolitan state in many areas. And despite that, and despite its permissive attitude towards guns, the homicide rate is very close to California's.
Yeah, and you listed out a number of other states that have a similar or lower homicide rate, gun-related homicide rate in particular as well,
yes,
than California. So you've got here Maine, North Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, Utah, Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, Montana, Alaska, Colorado, Wisconsin, West Virginia, Kansas, and Florida. So it's California's rate is just not that exceptional.
It's fine. I think I'd call it fine. Like, it's decent, but it's not exceptional. That's accurate. All those states you listed either have lower rates than California or only slightly higher rates than California.
Right. And actually the RAND Corporation, which is a nonprofit that does a lot of gun related research, that's a little more down the line than a lot of the other ones out there. Like, oftentimes, like John Hopkins, for instance, is funded by Bloomberg directly, their gun violence research program. And so RAND Corporation is a little bit more independent than some of the other groups out there, though they're not necessarily terribly ideologically focused one way or the other. They put out a new resource, I guess you'd call it, on their website that lets you look at all of the individual states on the basis of their gun death rate, their homicide rate, their suicide rate, their gun homicide rate, and their gun suicide rate. And honestly, while there's a lot more to that I'm very skeptical of inside of this new program that RAND is doing, including, they sort of they give you this tool that lets you try and adjust individual states' gun laws and then they give you like a percentage effect that would have on the murder or suicide rates, which I find highly, highly questionable that you could actually reliably do something like that based off of the evidence that exists, especially since a lot of these states, sometimes a state adopting the strictest gun laws will bring its murder rate down. Sometimes it'll make it go up. And it's like, okay, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think that the base tool of letting you see each state by gun murder rate and then just overall murder rate can be fairly useful. And what I see looking at it are frankly more regional differences than ideological differences. For instance, the South tends to be more violent. Most southern states have more overall homicides and gun-related homicides than most northeastern or Mountain West states do. And then they also tend to have fewer suicides than the Northeast or Mountain West.
Yeah, I
states.
believe the usual suicide majority, homicide minority actually flips in the South. I think it's actually more homicides in the South and less suicides. And I don't know what causes that, but
right.
I mean, you can say, for example, like a state like Mississippi is very similar to a state like Idaho in terms of gun laws, but they're polar opposites on the results, right? That Idaho is a very, very safe state and Mississippi is not. So
and so there seems to be a lot more going on here than
absolutely.
Just what gun laws you have in place and how many guns per capita you have in the state, which is another thing that's even harder to measure. But and then of course I think there's another inherent flaw in sort of even that basic approach of looking at these things from a state level, right? Because I believe you wrote a piece for us a while back that talked about this, but crime, especially murder, is not really a state level issue in the United States. It's more of a local issue, a city level issue. Same for suicide too, actually, and there's sort of the inverse problems, right? There's suicide rates tend to be higher in rural areas and lower in urban areas, and murder rates tend to be higher in urban areas and lower in rural areas. Is that right?
No, that's entirely correct. I think one of the states I had looked at was Missouri, where your homicide rate in Missouri depends entirely on whether you're in Kansas City or St. Louis. Because if you're not, it's very close to the national average. If you are, it's like sadly a third world country in terms of homicide rate. So,
yeah. So there's a lot that goes into this, of course, and I think that's a further knock on this idea of just trying to lump all gun deaths together and draw broad sweeping conclusions from that data. There's a lot of problems with that, right? It's not just that adding suicides makes it misleading. It's even that, not discussing the urban rural divide that makes it misleading as well, or even just trying to say that because one state has a certain gun policy, if it enacted a different one, the percentage of murders would change by 5% or 6%. I think these are not realistic approaches to studying this issue and coming up with solutions for it.
Yeah, it's you're playing at the margins with a lot of these laws, right? Like there's only maybe there's some gun control laws out there that could reduce homicide. I don't know, but it does seem like it hasn't had much of effect in at least my home state of California. There hasn't been a noticeable decline either way in how these policies are affecting this data.
So bottom line, what's your takeaway from all this? How do you want to see things move on from here?
I think there just needs to be more transparency, and sadly, I don't think it's actually going to happen. But because there's too much. There's a big, like we talked about earlier, the big motivation here for them to continue to include suicides in this data is because their data only works if they include suicide. So they're not going to drop it. And at the same time, when you push them on it, the gun control groups will always try and shame you for it, to say, why don't you care about suicides? Well, I think as an advocate for the gun rights side, I think how we counter that is actually be proactive in trying to combat suicide, so nobody can ever accuse us of not caring about them, because we do. But in terms of informing policy now, when you're talking about gun control, if you're going to push this suicide focused count, then your policy should be focused on stopping suicide, not on, taking away someone's 15 round Glock magazine, because that has no bearing on anything, at least not for suicide. So that's where I'm on that. And as for Governor Newsom, this is a perfect example of how he's a perfect example of why they do what they do, because they want politicians like him to repeat these statements.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you coming on the show again. This is the second time you've been on, so it's been a while, but it's good to have you back on, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future. I think you have a lot of good analysis to bring us.
Well, thanks, Stephen. It's always a pleasure. And like I said the last time I was on, everyone subscribe to The Reload. Stephen is doing important work, and we should support it.
Thank you. Well, hopefully we'll have some more of your pieces in the future if you have some more good ideas like this. And we really appreciate you contributing and coming on the show to explain your views on these things. And I think our audience enjoys it. I think we get a lot out of it. So we'll have to have you on again in the future. But for now, that's it. We're going to head over to the news update.
All right, it's time for the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined, of course, by Reload founder Steve Gutowski. How are we doing this week, Steve?
I'm doing all right. Jake, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, it's finally, the weather's warming up a little bit. We had about like a 3-day stretch of 0-degree weather here in Colorado. So finally the sun's out and it's being a little bit nicer out here. So
we had 80-degree weather yesterday in DC area in Virginia here, but it's going down to freezing this weekend, and we might get some snow for the first time. The rest of the country has been hit with a lot of these mega snowstorms this year, but in this particular area, we haven't had any snow at all, and we've had a lot of unseasonably warm weather. So it's kind of been the opposite for those of us out here, which I don't like. I prefer having all 4 seasons in my year, but I'm from Pennsylvania originally, so that's probably why.
Right. Yeah. Not used to the constant humidity even in February. But anyways, on to the news this week. You have a couple pieces about some new details that have come to light about actually an old lawsuit that the gun control group Brady had filed on behalf of a couple who lost their daughter in a mass shooting. If you want to tell us a little bit about some details that have come to light about how that lawsuit played out.
Yeah, this one's actually out of Colorado, where you are. It relates to the Aurora Theater shooting, where the parents of one of the victims attempted to sue Lucky Gunner and other retailers for selling ammunition and magazines and tear gas and body armor to the shooter. And it actually wasn't filed by Brady. This key detail here. It was filed at their urging and with their lawyers who were working pro bono, but Brady wasn't actually a plaintiff in this case. And that's important because when they lost this case, the plaintiffs had to pay for the legal fees of the defendants. And so this couple who'd lost their daughter in the Aurora shooting was forced to be on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Now, the thing is, this shouldn't have come as a surprise to anyone involved. This case was, the judge called it meritless. It was a symbolic case. This is something that the gun control groups have been doing for decades at this point. They started in the 90s, filing these cases that are not so much designed to win on the merits and get a ruling in their favor. They're more designed to tie up gun companies in litigation that costs them a lot of money. And so in response to this tactic, which again started in the 90s, you saw the federal government pass the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act in the early 2000s. And you also had some states pass sort of riders or complementary laws to that, including Colorado, which still has a law that makes it more likely that the plaintiffs in cases like this against gun companies will have to pay for the defendant's legal fees if they bring a case like this. And, and by a case like this, I mean a case where the claim is essentially that the gun company or the ammo companies in this particular case are liable for the actions of a third party who commits a criminal act like murdering someone, right? Even if the companies had no sort of involvement in the actual crime, the idea here is to try and hold gun companies liable for basically gun crime, generally speaking. And so those sorts of cases in Colorado are especially hazardous to plaintiffs. This case didn't really state any sort of claim beyond the fact that these companies sold legal products and marketed them for sale, and then somebody used their products, in this horrific way. So that's sort of the core of what happened here. And this case was never going to be won. It wasn't really designed to be won, and they didn't win. And when they didn't win, they had to pay for the legal fees. And the thing is that they apparently were not fully aware of all of this. That's what they told the Colorado Sun. And that's really the core of the story now. It's coming out. We knew years ago that they lost this case. They lost this case back in 2015. They were ordered to pay legal fees back then. Now we're finding out from them that it bankrupted them and they weren't fully aware of the potential consequences. Brady didn't inform them. At least that's what the couple says. Brady says otherwise. Brady says, we did inform them. We told them about the risks.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty, I'd say, unsavory if what they're saying is correct, that a major, it's not uncommon that, as you said, they weren't directly involved, but their lawyers helped bring this case forward. Mm-hmm. It's not uncommon for advocacy groups like this to kind of spur on these lawsuits that align with them ideologically that they can then use to either fundraise or raise awareness. But if it is unclear whether or not they communicated properly, that they could, in fact, be on the hook for hundreds of thousands of dollars, which they should have been aware. This law is longstanding. It actually predates the federal protection for gun liability shields. So it's not exactly that this was some novel law. This has been on the books for a while. So that's a pretty big deal. And like you said, Brady denies it, but it still raises some questions, I think, about the tactics of some of these groups.
Well, look, there may have been some conversation that Brady's lawyers had with this couple about, oh, well, if you lose, this is the potential consequences or what have you. But where they didn't really emphasize that they were absolutely guaranteed to lose. This was not a case that they were ever going to win. And it's not a case where they were likely to lose and not have to pay legal fees. That's the thing. Like Brady provided them lawyers without, pro bono. So, they told them, our lawyers won't cost you anything. But if they didn't make clear, and I think it's hard to see any other possibility here, they may have told them some basic level of the risks involved or had them sign a form or something. But clearly this couple did not get the full message. And that's the problem. That's what's highly unethical here. These cases are fairly unethical anyway, because they're basically slap lawsuits. They're not designed to win. They've had one significant settlement, which was, again, a settlement, not a court victory. And as you mentioned, it was because Remington went bankrupt and their insurers were the ones on the hook for this lawsuit. And they decided to pay out the remainder of the insurance policy that existed, which was a lot of money, to be fair, and is perfectly good reason that gun control activists have tried to copycat that case ever since. Of course, they've lost all of the other ones that have come up in that manner. But, these are not cases designed to win on the merits. Right. They're basically saying that you shouldn't have sold these legal products in the legal way that you did. Right. That's the bottom line. They're not accusing really these companies of breaking any sort of law. They're accusing them of selling products that they don't think people should be allowed to buy. That's sort of the bottom line of these cases. And that's the reason why you've seen this proliferation of laws that protect against this specific kind of case. There's plenty of other ways you can sue gun companies, just like really any product manufacturer or dealer. If the product is defective, there are plenty of gun lawsuits that deal with defective firearms designs, or if you defraud somebody or something, any of those other things. But you can't effectively sue a gun company just for selling guns, basically. And so, that's one level of questionability that goes on with these kinds of suits. In this particular case, it's even worse, I think, because clearly the plaintiffs, who are just, it seems they're just regular people or were just regular people, when they filed this suit, they obviously have their beliefs about gun control, which they're entitled to. And that's all well and good, but they obviously didn't have a clear understanding of what was going to happen when they filed this case. And Brady and their lawyers did have a clear understanding. There's no way they didn't know. Anyone who knows anything about this, I knew when this was happening, that this is how it was going to come out. That, there's the chance of it ending in a settlement like Remington is, any of these cases, is very small. That it's like one out of the thousands that this is, of these cases that have been brought over the decades. It's not, there is that one example now, so it's more than zero. But generally speaking, these cases are not designed to win. They're not designed to get to a ruling from the judge in favor of the plaintiffs. They're just designed to really tie up these companies in court, but also get favorable coverage. And this generated a lot of favorable coverage, right?
Right.
And the problem is these people weren't fully aware. It'd be one thing if they wanted to say, we really don't like this law. They're still advocating against the Colorado law at this point. That's actually what this story that the Colorado Sun wrote was about. This piece of information that they were misled into this settlement, into this, sanction, is way down in the Colorado Sun story, way towards the bottom. Most of the story is about how they want to change this law. And it's fine if they fully understood what was going to happen. They don't like the law. They're creating a situation where they're going to have to be, they're going to have to pay a lot of money in legal fees because of this law. That's fine. That's how a lot of political litigation works. You find a situation you don't like, you set up a test case, and you go from there, even if you know you're going to lose because you're trying to generate headlines and political pressure. And that's really what this case was doing. The problem is that the plaintiffs didn't understand that that's how it was going to turn out. They seem to really think that they win, and they still, frankly, they still seem pretty uninformed about the reality of what's going on, because this couple still wants to repeal this law, which is fine, but that's not going to really change what happened in their case. Even without that Colorado law, they probably still could have been held liable for damages, and it's much less likely, I think, without that law. But the case wouldn't have gone anywhere. The case is still it's still going to be blocked by the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which is a federal law.
Right. No, I agree. That's what I was going to bring up, the same point. The fact that, despite the hardship that they went through in this lawsuit and having to file for bankruptcy, they are, in fact, currently lobbying for the repeal of that law. And I believe at one point, at least the woman in this case actually worked for Brady for a little bit. So
yeah, Sandy Phillips.
Yeah. So it's clearly there's at least some ideological fellow traveling going on here.
This makes it more likely that they weren't lying about
being misled. That's true. that gives credence to their claim that they didn't feel fully informed on the risks, which is unfortunate. But it is worth noting that as of recording this, one day before we recorded this, Colorado did just introduce that bill to repeal this law. So we'll have to see how that goes. I think there's a good shot that they repeal it. But like you said, it doesn't really change the trajectory of these lawsuits. Perhaps the fee shifting goes away, but there's still a federal statute that governs this stuff.
I think fee shifting becomes less likely.
Sure.
Although it doesn't, the risk of that doesn't go away completely because these are still basically slap lawsuits. And if a judge feels that your claims are meritless, as the judge in this case did, he might still award legal fees because, why should the gun companies have to pay a bunch of money to defend against frivolous lawsuits? That's
right.
the whole concept of an anti-slap law, right? Frivolous lawsuits are bad. And so generally speaking, we try to disincentivize them as a society. Now, in this particular case, this is a law that's targeted specifically for the gun industry because they've been at the center of this tactic. But I think that gets at another important point. This worked, right? There's going to get a little bit of negative backlash for essentially driving this couple into bankruptcy for political purposes without their full knowledge of what was going on. But I think that's wildly outweighed by how much positive or favorable, at least, coverage they got by having this couple put in that situation. Right. There was a lot of coverage at the time. In my analysis piece on this, which is a member exclusive over at The Reload, I pointed to a Rachel Maddow segment. She did an outrage-o-meter. And of course, the whole segment's about how outrageous it was that they got saddled with this payment for legal fees. And, that was the whole point of doing this. That was what they were trying to get, is a bunch of negative coverage about this law so that eventually, so that it would put political pressure. Now, it's working now. Part of that is Colorado has just become more blue since 2015, right? But part of it is that there's an example of this, why Democrats should think this law is bad. And it was set up from the beginning. This was the whole concept of this case, not to win, but to lose in a way that generates a lot of attention and political pressure. And it worked,
right?
Even though the people at the center of it feel misled and were bankrupted in the process, which is crazy because I think a lot of people had assumed, including me, actually at the time when I covered this, the outcome of this, I had written that it was Brady who was ordered to pay these legal fees because Brady is going around talking about this as their case. They're providing the lawyers. The judge talked about how this is a basically political stunt by Brady, that he was alluding to them paying for this settlement. But in reality, they weren't on the hook. They didn't pay anything. They didn't help these people at all once they were ordered to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Like they were just non-existent. And they told us, to their credit, they explained, one, they repeatedly said that they did inform this couple, although we've already gone over why that, even if they said something, it clearly wasn't enough. And then they said they just don't have enough money to cover costs, to cover settlements like this, which is pretty gross to me, to be honest with you.
Right.
Like, then why did you rope these people into this case? They couldn't cover it either. They went bankrupt. And also, like, Brady, while smaller than Everytown or Giffords or the NRA or these other groups, is a multi-million-dollar organization. If you can't cover the legal fees, and you haven't had a conversation with the plaintiffs saying, "Are you sure you can cover these?" then it's hard to conclude that your purpose in this wasn't to bankrupt these people for political reasons, to get headlines out of it, right? I mean, that's what happened, and it worked, right? This law is probably going to be repealed, and it's at least in part because of what happened in this case. And I just find the whole thing terrible. Like, that's a terrible tactic. But I don't, and I wonder how often this happens in other cases. How often are they not fully informing these plaintiffs, or at the very least, how often are the plaintiffs not fully understanding what's going on? Because that's highly unethical in my mind.
Right.
Highly unethical. One of the worst tactics I've seen in gun litigation ever. It's disturbing.
Yeah, no, it definitely is a bit distasteful, but as you said, it paid off for him. So it doesn't seem like the incentive is there.
So there's
to
really
not do
no,
it. So, yeah,
there's no reason they wouldn't do it again. I mean, this is, and part of it is media coverage, right? Part of it is just incredulous media coverage of this stuff. Maddow's segment is a perfect example of it. She's upset that this settlement was ordered, but doesn't get into why that happened. And now, to be fair to her, I don't think anyone understood at the time that Brady wasn't going to help these people pay this settlement. Technically, yes. So I had to correct my piece because I had assumed that Brady was going to be on the hook. And no, they weren't plaintiffs, so they weren't on the hook. But it was still assumed by many people, including the judge, that Brady was going to help them, after the fact, pay for this settlement. And it turns out they didn't at all. And, the setup of this case should have been obvious to everyone involved. Like, there was no chance this case was going to win. It wasn't a particularly well written brief. It didn't have any real causes of action, and the outcome was inevitable from the moment it was filed. So I think all of the positive press that Brady generated from this, part of that is media. Part of that's on the media, just is.
Yeah.
But most of it is on Brady, because this is what they were trying to do. They were successful in it, and it's a gross tactic. It's very, very gross, especially to people who are their allies. This is, I can't imagine ever being involved in something like that and not feeling dirty afterwards. I don't know. I'm being very...
It does leave a bad taste in your mouth. I agree. Yeah.
I think this set of lawsuits is pretty bad to begin with. This whole tactic is unethical in my mind. And then this is just takes it to a new level of bad. But we have another story real quick here that we broke this week on another gun group, right? It's sort of to change gears a little bit. We had an exclusive story on the NRA, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. You broke this story, actually, that in fact, Jason Wimay, the head of NRA ILA, the Institute for Legislative Action, their lobbying arm, their political activity arm, he is leaving the organization. He's stepping down from his role, and I believe he's going to another private firm. He's going to step away from the political spotlight for a while.
Well, he's going to like a consulting firm. Yeah.
A consulting firm, yeah. Which is a big deal because ILA is, as with the NRA being in turmoil as it has been, as we've reported repeatedly over the past couple of years, ILA has been one of the functions of the organization that's remained fairly active. And to have someone that's been at the helm depart, I think that raises a few red flags, perhaps. We don't know who's going to fill his shoes, but certainly that's not great for the NRA. Yeah,
it's certainly not great. Jason Wimay was the person who replaced Chris Cox, who was the longtime top lobbyist at the NRA, the one who had a lot of the connections with, for instance, the Trump White House, and who had been running the group for decades before he was forced out during the internal struggle back in 2019. And so Wimay had to come in and take over that role. And now he's gone less than 4 years later of his own volition too. So not a great sign for them. And obviously we've reported extensively on their declining membership numbers. They're down over 1 million members in the last 4 years, and that equals a declining revenue basis as well. So on top of that news, having your top lobbyist choose to leave at the NRA is just more really bad news for the group. And it's hard to imagine how they're going to replace him with somebody who has the same level of experience and influence that we may had, let alone Chris Cox. So I don't know what they're going to do, but it's just a further indication of how far down the NRA has spiraled to this point, and how much further they're likely to go in the near term here. But we have unfortunately had to do a lot of negative stories on them in the past, really couple of years now. And it doesn't seem like that trend is going to let up anytime soon. So, we, of course, will cover both sides of this debate as independently as we possibly can. And we have more stories like the Brady one, we will bring that to you. And we have more stories like what's going on at the NRA, we'll bring that to you as well. People deserve to know these things. Wherever you fall on the political spectrum, it's important to stay informed. And that's our job, is to inform people. So we will continue to do that, right, Jake? As best as we can.
That's right, yeah.
We're obviously a small publication here. We're independent. We don't take money from any of these groups, and never have and never will. Nobody pays us to write anything other than our members, who are how we keep this thing going. The Reload is a member-funded publication, 100% member-funded. It's 100% owned by me, and we think that gives us an advantage in these sorts of stories, because we can remain independent while being informed and bring you sober, serious firearms reporting and analysis. And that's what we're going to continue to do. If you want to help support us in that, you can like and share this video or podcast wherever you're listening to it. You can rate us, give us a rating, give us a thumbs up on YouTube, what have you. You can head over to thereload.com and sign up for our free newsletter. Or if you're already signed up for that newsletter, you can take it to the next step and become one of those members that supports our reporting. We have a yearly and a monthly membership option. If you want to help fund what we're doing, you will also, of course, get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of reporting and analysis that you can't find anywhere else, that are member exclusives. You will get this podcast a day early, as well as the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment. So make sure you head over to thereload.com and check out those options today. And we will be back again for you next week.
No, the devil's got no